All right, so we are starting our talk about evolution. And who is, of course, the most famous scientist when we talk about evolution is Charles Darwin. So instead of me going through the slides about him, I'm going to play a little 5-minute video about him. It's much more interesting than just reading the words on a page. I'm visual, so I like that.
History in a nutshell. Who was Charles Darwin, you say? Only one of the most famous scientists in history. He was the first person to explain the fundamental scientific theory that evolution is caused by natural selection, and that humans and animals share common ancestors. It was a groundbreaking idea that caused huge controversy in Victorian England and changed the way we think about the natural world. Darwin was born into a wealthy family in 1809. His dad expected him to become a doctor or a priest, but at university, Charles was much more keen on the world around him. He helped name plants at the University Museum, debated natural history, learned how to stuff birds, collected beetles, and much besides. At just 22, Darwin set off on a round-the-world voyage that took him to South America, Australasia, and Africa. It wasn't your average gap year. Darwin didn't come home for 5 years, and the things he experienced on his voyage influenced him for the rest of his life. He ventured into dense rainforests, climbed mountains in the Andes, and explored the Galapagos Islands, collecting and observing plants, animals, and fossils along the way. He joined the carnival in Brazil, and even got caught up in a rebellion in Uruguay. It was quite the adventure. When he eventually arrived back in England, Darwin began working with other scientists on the findings from his voyage. He published his diaries of the trip in 1839 and became one of the leading lights of London's scientific society. Darwin's health got worse around this time, and he'd suffer from illness for most of the rest of his life. But his personal life wasn't all bad. In 1838, Charles married his cousin, Emma. The couple started a family, and in 1842, she convinced him to move to Down House in Kent. The gardens at Down House were the site of many experiments. Charles bred fancy pigeons, studied the flight of bumblebees, and grew all sorts of varieties of plants. He and Emma were much less strict than other parents of the time. They encouraged their children to play and explore the world around them. Charles carried on publishing respected books and articles on everything from geology to botany and barnacles. But behind closed doors, he was also working on theories that would rock Victorian society. From as early as the 1830s, Darwin had been trying to answer difficult questions about the natural world. But he knew his theory of natural selection flew in the face of accepted religious ideas about creation, especially because it meant that humans evolved from other earlier animal species. Eventually, in 1859, he published his famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. It caused a lot of controversy, but it gained lots of support too. Darwin's health was getting worse, and so he stayed out of the public eye. But his friends and allies defended his work. Many new editions came out, and the book was published throughout the world. For the rest of his life, Darwin carried on working and writing at Down House. He published more books and carried out more experiments with plants and animals. All of his work was designed to test his grand theory of natural selection. He died in 1882 and was buried in Westminster Abbey as a national hero. His theory has been scrutinized and developed in the 140 years since, but his ideas and life's work still form the basis of how we understand the development of the natural world today. Cheers, Charles.
All right, so that is Charles Darwin. Here's just a map of his journey on the Beagle. It took 5 years, and you can see it went all around the world. People would kill to take cruises like this nowadays. So On the Origin of Species was his famous book. The Biology Came of Age, November 24th, 1859. He published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, an assemblage of facts about the natural world. And his voyage was from 1831 to 1836, so it took him over 20 years to analyze, write the book, and then find the courage to publish the book that he knew would go against the foundations of modern society, like they said in the video. Darwin made 3 observations from these facts. Life shows rich diversity. There are similarities in life that allow the classification of organisms into groups nested within broader groups. Organisms display many striking ways in which they are suited for their environments. These were his 3 main takeaways from the facts collected in his book. And then the other 2 main ideas: organisms inhabiting Earth today descended from ancestral species, and natural selection is the mechanism for descent with modification. Descent means when organisms keep having more and more offspring, those are your descendants. And then with each generation, there are modifications. There's going to be a lot of videos linked in this chapter. We're not going to watch them all, obviously, but we'll watch a couple. In this book, Darwin proposed a hypothesis. Just like any other scientist, there's a little blurb about what a hypothesis is if you don't remember. He used hundreds of pages in the book to describe the evidence supporting his hypothesis. He made testable predictions, and then he reported the results of numerous experiments he had performed. So he used the scientific method just like we use it today. Just like we use it in class, and researchers used it to come up with a vaccine for the coronavirus. He followed the method. And because he followed the method, other scientists have come along and repeated his experiments. And they've all come up with evidence that support his original hypotheses. So his hypothesis: present-day species are the descendants of ancient ancestors that they still resemble in some ways. And the change occurs as a result of descent with modification, with natural selection as the mechanism. We'll, of course, get more into natural selection here in a minute. Natural selection is a process in which organisms with certain inherited characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals with other characteristics. Inherited is underlined because it's important that it's an inherited characteristic, something that can be passed on to the next generation. As a result of natural selection, a whole population will change over generations. The population is defined as a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. So if just one individual changes, it doesn't matter. To be considered natural selection, an entire generation has to take on new characteristics that the previous generation did not have. Adaptation to evolution. So natural selection leads to evolutionary adaptation. When we talk about evolutionary adaptation, it's a population's increase in the frequency of traits suited to the environment. So like I said, we're talking about entire populations, not just one individual organism. Natural selection thus leads to evolution, which can be seen either as a change in the genetic composition of one single population, or on the grander scale, the entire biological history from the earliest microbes to the enormous diversity of organisms that live on Earth today. So we can talk about evolution as a as a single unit within a population, or we talk about evolution on the larger scale, the evolution of everything. So we have to start with the smaller scale, and then we go to the larger scale. Evidence for evolution. It leaves observable signs that scientists have been observing since Darwin came out with his ideas. And we're going to examine 5 of the many lines of evidence: the fossil record, biogeography, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and molecular biology. The fossil record. Everybody knows what fossils are. They're imprints or remains of organisms that lived in the past. They're often found in sedimentary rocks. They're found other places too. There's amber fossils where insects are preserved in amber. But sedimentary rocks is the standard for fossils. The fossil record is the ordered sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers. It reveals the appearance of organisms in a historical sequence. Older organisms are found deeper in the rocks. And it fits with the molecular and cellular evidence that prokaryotes are the ancestors of all life. So the fossil record is something scientists started with and said, hey, look at all these layers. The older stuff must be on the bottom. As they used more technological means to test things, like molecular and DNA and chemical composition, they found that it supported whatever was in the fossil record. So these are just some of the layers that you can see. If you've ever driven to Vegas or driven to Arizona, you've seen rocks like these. We have them all over the Southwest. And these are the layers that scientists will find things stuck in these layers. And the bottom layers hold older things, the top layers, the fossils tend to be newer. Paleontologists, which are the scientists who study fossils, have discovered many transitional forms that link past and present. Transitional fossils that they found include evidence that birds descended from one branch of dinosaurs, and whales descended from 4-legged land mammals. Biogeography is line number 2. It's the study of the geographic distribution of species. This first suggested to Darwin that today's organisms evolved from ancestral forms. And Darwin noted that Galapagos animals resembled species of the South American mainland more than they resembled animals on similar but distant islands. So just because it's an island doesn't mean all islands had the same organisms. Those organisms had to come from somewhere. And since he'd been all over the world and been to all kinds of different islands and collected a lot of different species, he could actually see that this stuff looks more like South America than it does Australia, which is just another island. And the things he found in Australia, of course, are different from pretty much anywhere else on the planet. Many examples from biogeography would be difficult to understand, except from an evolutionary perspective. And one example is the distribution of marsupial mammals in Australia. Marsupials are things like kangaroos, koalas, and they're only found in Australia. They're not found anywhere else naturally on the planet.
125 million years ago, northeastern China was joined to North America in a vast continental block named Eurasia. A fossil skeleton from this time provides our only clue to the original ancestor of all marsupials. Its name, Sinudelphus zarlii. It measured about 6 inches long and weighed about an ounce, like a tiny mouse. The first marsupial was a climber, and most likely spent its days scampering across low branches of bushes, feeding on insects. The next oldest marsupial fossil was found in what is now Utah, in the United States, dated around 110 million years ago. So it appears that marsupials dispersed south from North America, most likely via a small arc of volcanic islands. During this marathon journey, the tiny mouse-like Sinudelphus mutated into variations of the original marsupial. And these species spread into what remained of the ancient continent, Gondwana. Gondwana began breaking up 130 million years ago, and finally, Australia ruptured from Antarctica and formed a new continent, trapping many of the new species of marsupials.
Comparative anatomy is the next line. It's a comparison of body structure between different species. And it attests that evolution is a remodeling process in which ancestral structures become modified as they take on new functions. So evolution and natural selection, they don't start over, they just work with what's there and make it better. Make sure those better traits or characteristics that's going to help the animal survive last into the next generation. Homology is a similarity in structures due to common ancestry. This is illustrated by the remodeling of the pattern of bones, forming the forelimbs of mammals for different functions. So all mammals have the same bones in their arms and their wrists and their hands. They're just shaped differently because different animals use them for different things. A whale obviously uses them to swim. A bat uses them to fly. But you can see the same structure of bones in X-rays. Vestigial structures are remnants of features that served an important function in an organism's ancestors, but now have only marginal, if any, importance. We have quite a few vestigial structures that our bodies don't really use anymore. Our tailbone is one of them. We don't have tails. Why do we need a tailbone? Our wisdom teeth, those are vestigial structures. We don't need that many teeth anymore. Our appendix, people used to think that was a second stomach from when we only ate once a month. Our appendix does nothing but cause trouble now. Other animals also have vestigial structures. You can see whales have a pelvis and a femur. What do they need those for? They don't walk. They're structures that have gotten smaller and smaller over time, and might eventually disappear. But it points to a common ancestor with mammals. Early stages of development, comparative embryology. You hear embryo. Embryos are tiny babies in a mother's womb. So scientists compare these embryos for the similarities and differences. So early stages of development in different animal species reveal additional homologous relationships. For example, pharyngeal pouches appear on the side of an embryo's throat, right here, as they're growing inside wombs, which, if the embryo is a fish, will eventually develop into gills. But in us, they actually develop into part of our ear and throat. We obviously don't have gills. We don't need gills. So our bodies restructured them to something we do need. Comparative embryology of vertebrates supports evolutionary theory. These are pictures of two different embryos, a chicken and a human. You can see the pharyngeal pouches. They all have them as embryos and they look the same. And then post-anal tails, ours goes away because we don't have a tail. So scientists will do things like this. There's a bunch of embryos at the top. Can you tell the difference? Not really. As they grow, they take another picture. Okay, now we're starting to see little differences among these mammal embryos, or vertebrate embryos, I'm sorry. And as they grow, now you can really tell the difference. But in the beginning, all the embryos looked pretty much the same. You couldn't tell them apart. And in the end, you have everything from a fish to a human. Molecular biology is the main tool they use today to determine evolutionary relationships. Since the discovery of DNA, of course, our technology has advanced wildly since we discovered what DNA is and how it's put together. The hereditary background of an organism is documented in both its DNA and the proteins encoded by the DNA. Evolutionary relationships among species can be determined by comparing genes and proteins of different organisms. That's a field called comparative genomics. And you can see in the chart, we share almost 100% of our DNA with chimpanzees. It's something like 98.7. And then there's a whole article about what parts of our DNA are different from our closest relatives. Natural selection. Darwin noted the close relationship between adaptation to the environment and origin of new species. So back to Darwin. The evolution of finches on the Galapagos Islands is an excellent example. Finches are birds. And he could tell they all resembled each other on the Galapagos Islands. But like the Galapagos are a set of islands. So each population of birds was just a little bit different. And it had to do with their food. What did they eat? Did they eat insects? Did they eat fruit? Did they eat cactus? Did they eat seeds? If they ate fruit, their beak doesn't have to be very strong. But if they're trying to get seeds out of nuts, maybe, their beak has to be that much stronger. And they evolved over time a stronger beak because it's better suited to the environment eating seeds. So Darwin's theory of natural selection based on two key observations. All species tend to produce excessive numbers of offspring, and organisms vary. Much of this variation is heritable. So even us, we have the potential to produce a lot of offspring. Girls ovulate once a month for 30 years. Boys make sperm. They make millions and millions of sperm cells, way more than it is needed. So just because we don't have an excess of offspring doesn't mean we don't have the potential to. So overproduction leads to competition. All species have the potential to produce many more offspring than the environment can support. And this leads to inevitable competition among individuals. They compete for their parents' attention, they compete for food, they compete for shelter. And I read an article that there's even I think it's a moth. I can't remember. It's some kind of insect. But if there is one certain offspring that's requiring too much of attention, they'll kill it because it's to the detriment of the whole family. Okay, you're not doing what's best for the whole family. You're going to cost us all our lives. You're done. And then individual variation. Variation just means there's differences among individuals of the same species. Humans are the same species, but we have variation. We have differences. Gender, height, color, hair, eyes, nose. And much of this variation is heritable. We got it from our parents. We will eventually pass it on to our children. And variation results from processes that both involve randomness. Mutations is one, and then sexual recombination, that crossing over during meiosis, is the other. This is where variation in populations come from. Darwin's theory of natural selection, he made an inference from all of his observations: unequal reproductive success. These individuals with traits best suited to the local environment generally leave a larger share of surviving fertile offspring. So the ones who survive, who are best suited to their environment, whether it's to get food, to hide from predators, whatever organisms survive, that's who lives and gets to reproduce. If you don't have good traits to hide from predators, you're going to get eaten. You don't live long enough to make offspring. So examples of natural selection: peppered moth. There's all kinds of videos here, but the peppered moth is the typical one. And then there's one about COVID-19, all the way to COVID-19. Natural selection is happening right now. There are different strains of COVID-19 popping up. They're mutating. So the main causes of evolutionary change: there's genetic drift, is the change in the gene pool of a small population due to chance. Chance is that mutation or sexual recombination. And there's two examples of this: the bottleneck effect or the founder effect. Gene flow is another cause of evolutionary change. And then natural selection, of course, which is the most important because it is the only process that promotes adaptation. Which features are best to survive in a certain environment? The bottleneck effect: everybody's probably been through a bottleneck on a highway when you got 3 lanes going down to 1. So it's going very, very slow and only a few cars are getting through at a time. That's called a bottleneck. So it's a severe reduction in population size, usually due to a disaster. So you can see in the picture, you've got the parent population where the genes are about even, yellow and blue. And then there's some kind of a bottleneck. Something happens. There's a fire and it kills 75% of the organisms, whatever those organisms are. So it's a drastic reduction in population. Then you have the surviving individuals. Now the surviving ones, you got mostly blue and only a couple of yellow. So the next generation, those alleles look very, very different than the parent population because most of them died. And most of them that died had those yellow alleles. So it decreases the overall genetic variability in a population because at least some alleles are lost. And those are just the ones you can see. Results from a loss of individual variation. The founder effect happens when a few individuals colonize an isolated habitat. This represents genetic drift in a whole new colony. The founder effect explains the relatively high frequency of certain inherited disorders in some small human populations. So you can see in the picture, the ancestral or original population of butterflies on an island, you had brown, orange, and white. And then a couple said, I don't want to live here anymore, so they went to colonize a new island. But you only have orange and brown now. So that variation decreased again. And what if the white ones had an extra allele, an extra trait that made them immune to certain diseases? That new colony is going to get wiped out real quick because they don't have that trait. And gene flow is genetic exchange with another population. This happens all the time. It may result in the gain or loss of alleles and tend to reduce genetic differences between populations. Happens a lot in insects and birds. They have wings, they can fly to new places easily.